Wars are remembered for soldiers and generals, for trenches and artillery, for suffering and courage. Yet beneath every battle lies an invisible system without which armies could neither move nor survive: transportation. World War I was not only a conflict of guns and trenches, but a colossal contest of roads, railways, ports, bridges, and supply routes. Every bullet, every loaf of bread, every wounded soldier, every weapon, and every order relied on these arteries of movement. The Great War created new frontiers of mobility and immobility. Railways pulsed like the veins of empires, feeding troops into the front lines. Roads cracked under the weight of millions of boots and hooves. Tunnels, bridges, and convoys became battlegrounds in their own right. Behind the thunder of guns, a quieter but equally relentless struggle unfolded, the struggle to keep the war moving. This is the story of the infrastructure that sustained the Great War. When war erupted in 1914, European armies mobilized with breathtaking speed, not because of manpower alone, but because of railroads. Railways had become the strategic backbone of nations, capable of transporting entire armies in days, something impossible in earlier centuries. Train stations became scenes of controlled chaos. Locomotives hissed steam as soldiers climbed into crowded carriages. Workers loaded ammunition crates, artillery parts, sacks of food, and medical supplies. Officers stood over thick timetables, calculating how many trains could move per hour and which lines needed priority. Mobilization was a ballet of steam and steel. Every train had a precise schedule. A delay of 30 minutes could alter an entire campaign. Germany's sweeping invasion plan depended on a delicate choreography of trains funneling troops toward Belgium and France. France's opening strategy relied on railways to move divisions to its eastern frontier. Russia mobilized massive numbers across vast distances, slower due to outdated infrastructure, but still impossible without rail. The first days of the war were decided not by battles, but by timetables. Once armies reached the front, railways continued to define the war's shape. The static trench lines of the Western Front created enormous logistical challenges. Millions of soldiers lived in a narrow band of territory stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. To sustain them, food, ammunition, timber, medical supplies, animals, fuel, and replacement troops had to move constantly. Railways became the backbone of this vast supply system. Major lines carried heavy goods to large depots behind the front. From there, smaller branch lines, known as light railways, extended like capillaries into the war zone. Little steam engines hauled narrow-gauge trains directly to the edges of trenches, where men unloaded cargo at night to avoid detection. Every artillery shell fired had once been carried by rail. Every meal eaten by a soldier depended on a train. Every reinforcement, every evacuation, every order moved on tracks. Without railways, the Western Front could not have existed. If railways provided speed and heavy movement, roads provided flexibility and constant access. They were the most visible signs of a world reshaped by war. Armies marched across them in endless columns. Refugees fled along them. Ambulances rushed wounded men over them. Horses, mules, and oxen hauled wagons across surfaces that quickly deteriorated into broken stones and mud. Roads cracked under the weight of war. Rain turned them into rivers of sludge. Shellfire ripped them apart. Engineers labored day and night to repair damaged paths. Wooden planks were laid over mud to create corduroy roads. Gravel was dumped, leveled, and compacted. Bridges were rebuilt repeatedly, sometimes collapsing hours after repair, because Bonna's artillery found them again. Roads were the backbone of mobility near the front, a fragile, battered backbone continually broken and restored. Among the most important uses of roads was the evacuation of the wounded. In 1914, many armies still relied on horse-drawn ambulances. These vehicles struggled on damaged roads and often took hours to reach dressing stations. As the war continued, motor ambulances transformed casualty evacuation. They moved faster, handled difficult terrain better, and could carry more wounded per trip. Volunteer drivers, many of them women, coordinated routes through chaotic landscapes of shell holes and traffic jams. The wounded traveled along roads that shook with explosions, past convoys and marching troops, toward field hospitals that waited behind the lines. Every hour saved on a road meant more lives saved on an operating table. Railway systems did not exist in isolation. They connected directly to ports that served as the war's global entry points. Colonial troops, food shipments, raw materials, oil, and ammunition all passed through harbors. Ships brought Canadian wood, Indian grain, Australian wool, New Zealand meat, American supplies, African laborers, and Asian workers into Europe's war machine. Ports became fortresses of cranes, warehouses, and rails that moved goods rapidly inland. A bottleneck at a harbor could cripple entire sectors of the front. The war was global not only in combat, but in commerce. Transportation made it possible. Unlike the dense rail networks of Western Europe, the Eastern Front covered vast territories with fewer tracks and fewer good roads. Armies maneuvered across plains, forests, marshes, and mountains. This created a war defined by movement rather than stalemate. Battles shifted hundreds of miles in weeks. Here, mobility depended heavily on long-distance trains, horse-drawn wagons, sleighs in winter pontoon bridges, river transport. Armies rose or fell based on their ability to move through landscapes unprepared for conflict. The cold, more than enemy action, often decided which side advanced and which collapsed. Outside Europe, the war confronted entirely different terrains. In the Middle East, desert expeditions relied on camel caravans, specially constructed desert railways, water pipelines, long marches over burning sand. The Hejaz Railway became a strategic artery, targeted repeatedly by raids. Armies lived and died by their access to wells and oases more than their access to ammunition. In Africa, jungles and savannas made movement extremely difficult. Rain turned paths into rivers. Heat exhausted porters and animals. Rail networks were sparse, so human labor carried supplies across miles of wild terrain. The war's global reach exposed how deeply transportation defined strategy. Railways were too important to leave untouched. Sabotage, bombardment, and infiltration became everyday threats. Artillery targeted junctions to disrupt supply lines. Spies monitored train schedules. Saboteurs blew up bridges and tunnels. Aircraft bombed rail stations and depots. A single destroyed bridge could halt an entire offensive. A delay in ammunition trains could decide the outcome of a battle. As much as trenches were fought over, railways were fought over too, quietly but decisively. Though animals and trains dominated early in the war, motor vehicles grew more important with each passing year. Trucks moved men and goods where tracks did not reach. Tanks, slow, unreliable, yet groundbreaking, marked the beginning of mechanized warfare. Motorcycles carried dispatch riders through labyrinths of trenches and roads. While early engines struggled in mud and cold, their evolution hinted at the future. A world where mobility would no longer depend on rails alone. The war was the birthplace of modern military transport. None of the war's movement would have been possible without millions of laborers who built and maintained roads, rails, and depots. Engineers laid tracks under fire. Labor battalions dug trenches and cleared wreckage. Colonial workers from China, India, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific performed grueling construction tasks with little recognition. Their work shaped the war's geography. Their hands built the arteries of conflict. Their contributions were often erased from memory. Yet without them, armies would have starved, stalled, or surrendered. When the armistice arrived in 1918, the massive transportation networks created for war did not simply disappear. Railways remained as strengthened arteries of commerce. Roads built for troop movements became civilian transportation routes. Ports expanded by wartime necessity grew into global trade hubs. Technical innovations in engines, logistics, and planning influenced modern business and travel. The war, in destroying so much, had also built more than it intended. World War I is often remembered for the immobility of trenches, yet beneath that stillness lay a relentless movement of goods, people, and information. The war's true battlefield stretched far beyond no man's land, into stations, depots, tunnels, docks, highways, and quiet sidings where locomotives waited in the night. The Great War was not only a battle of nations, but a battle of routes. Victory belonged not just to armies, but to infrastructure. The iron, wood, stone, and sweat that kept war alive. Every soldier in the trenches depended on distant forces they never saw. The engineer repairing a broken bridge. The railway worker coordinating a midnight convoy. The driver navigating a dark, cratered road. The laborer clearing rubble under shell fire. The mechanic who coaxed one more mile out of a failing engine. Their work formed the invisible skeleton of the conflict.